Good morning, and thank you for having us, and it's a privilege to speak to the group here. When I moved to Israel in summer of 1995 with my wife and children and started working at a law firm in Tel Aviv, I very quickly had the opportunity to see some of the leading edge of international transactions in Israel at that time, and perhaps by coincidence, the first thing I worked on was the closing of the Unilever investment in Strauss ice cream, which happened very soon after I arrived. And that was very interesting as an example of the internationalization of Israeli business through a very traditional Israeli company model, expanding out and making strategic alliances and expanding its business internationally. At that same time, I also had the pleasure of working on investments in a relatively unknown Israeli company called Checkpoint Software in late 1995, and then its IPO a few months later, that being like Mirabilis, which was emerging at that same time, now ICQ, an Israeli company developed in Israel by Israelis, and then going out internationally. We were also seeing at that time the influx of the Aliyah from the Soviet Union and a substantial world of Anglo Aliyah of professionals, whether they were engineers, lawyers, or accountants. And what we saw in the next several years after that is the subject of my presentation, and a point that was alluded to, I think, by Amir in his, which is the way in which Israeli companies became and continue to now be conceived of in a new paradigm, which is really a company that from the outset is born global. Let me begin with a couple of examples of some recent companies, or relatively recent companies, the last 5-7 years that I've worked with, as examples of companies that are, as we're saying here, born global. The first example is a software company. The technology was developed in Israel, but the company was incubated, actually, largely in the U.S. by Israeli expatriates who had come to the U.S. working for a larger Israeli company and had found this technology, set up a company that was a U.S. parent with an Israeli subsidiary with management in both this region and in Israel. The R&D developed in Israel, the marketing and sales already ready to go, being a software company, quickly moving to market in the U.S., and then drawing very quickly investors from what we would call the modern international private equity world, which is a combination of international money sitting in funds that either reside in Israel, some of them did there, or reside in the U.S. with parallel funds or advisors in Israel. Another quick example, which has got an interesting twist to it, is a company that develops a communications hardware software product where the main management is, again, both right from the start in the U.S. and in Israel, with a substantial amount of input from Bulgarian software engineers working closely with Israeli software engineers, where a lot of the R&D was done. And again, overall, a U.S. Parent entity with subs around the world. The initial investors primarily from the U.S., and like all of these, with an initial focus on a very international market. And then finally, one very recent example in which 3 entrepreneurs have come together. 2 of them are professors, one of whom is an American professor in the U.S., the other an Israeli professor in the U.S., the other an Israeli, living in the U.S., but the R&D being carried out from the start in Israel, raising capital from a collection of U.S. and Israeli investors right from the start. All of these entities share a common attribute. From the start, all were internationally oriented, all were born global. So briefly, what is the DNA that see of a company that's born global? First and foremost, it's the state of mind. It's the idea that from the outset, the entity cuts across borders, and that the organization, the personnel, the product, the marketing, the markets are international right from the start. Almost immediately, we see a launch of international operations, whether that's R&D in one country or several countries. We also, and this is essential, there is right from the start, an international development and sales focus. Personnel, as I noted before, they can come from a number of different countries. They can be located in a number of different countries. The same is true for where the tasks, R&D, and marketing are. Interestingly, a lot of these companies tend to be focused on intellectual property, ideas. We've heard that as the core of a lot of these types of companies, and from the start, they're focused on protecting their intellectual property internationally in order to be able to attack the international market. From a legal structure, as we talked about, they will frequently be multinational, often a U.S. parent for a variety of reasons in order to maximize the ability to raise money in international markets or do international transactions. And similarly, they're going to be looking at international sources of funding, and their professional support, whether it's lawyers or accountants sitting in Tel Aviv, New York, or Washington, will be a combination of Israelis, Israelis who were born outside Israelis, and American and others. Israel is not unique in this respect, but I would suggest that it is probably the most successful and widespread country in the world to launch these born global companies.